rise of that particular cultural and political manifestation. As opposed to this man we'll be talking about in a little bit, Edward Steichen. Steichen, of course, you may remember from the early days when we talked about the photo secession and his relationship with Stieglitz. During World War II, he became head of the Naval Photographic Unit for the United States and trained many of the photographers who would have an impact in the latter half of the 20th century. This is a typical image of what he was sort of doing when he traveled with the aircraft carriers and onto the islands. There's also a boldness that was coming about in photography too. There was a conscientious attempt, at least on the part of the American military, not to show dead U.S. soldiers. So when this image was finally published in 1944, it was a shocking image to show actual soldiers that had been killed in battle. Normally it was politely declined on the part of editors, but it began to be seen more and more towards the end of World War II. And of course, Robert Capa and his invasion with the troops on D-Day is a very notable instance of where you actually went into the belly of the beast and came back with the photographs. During the first day of the D-Day invasion, June 6, 1944, Capa was on the landing crafts. He came in with them. He went into the surf. He dodged the bullets and everything else. At the end of the day, he'd done about 10 rolls of film, 35 millimeter film. He sent it back on a boat to England to be processed and set on the wire services, so there would be pictures of the battle. They were so excited in the offices to get the film that they immediately rushed it through processing, and they left it in the heater too long. So that of the 10 rolls of film, only about 9 images were not melted off the emulsion of the film. This is one of those rare pictures that Capa took. So even the process of involving the creation of imagery in war was something that could, in effect, be affected by the war too. The war was seen in both fronts as well. This is the work of Evgeny Khalday, one of the great Russian photographers who accompanied the troops in Russia during World War II, and also covered such things as the Russian flag going up over the Reichstag in Berlin when it fell in 1945. Or the aftermath, of course, when they went into the actual concentration camps and relieved and freed the prisoners there. Or the battle victims on Iwo Jima and the other islands in the Pacific in World War II, covered by such people as Gene Smith. I want to stop and dwell upon one particular image because I think it's important to consider in light of the whole respect of how a photograph evolves. And that involves, of course, the very famous picture of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. 1945, the South Pacific. This is the entire island of Iwo Jima, some 13 square miles, including at its northern end, Mount Suribachi, which is where the flag raising took place. This is an aerial photograph of the entire island. It was not considered a major strategic point in terms of the overall effect of the war, but it did have certain significance, primarily with the United States Air Force, because it was a lone island in the middle of the Pacific where planes could stop and refuel on their way to the final battles in Japan. It also became significant as a backup island for the bomber, which would eventually drop the atomic bomb too. So it had strategic importance, enough so that they threw a major battle there in February and March of 1945. There were some 80,000 Japanese troops buried in that island in the cave systems throughout it to protect and defend the island. And the U.S. military ended throwing out something like 70,000 Marines at them to try and do that battle. It occurred over, like I said, a 5-week period. Total number of deaths at the end of it, the Japanese, some 65,000. Americans, some 7,000. More died in the course of 5 weeks there than in the entire liberation of Iraq, shall we say, for the last 10 years. Proportionately a significant amount of death. It was probably still on record the bloodiest Marine engagement in the history of the Corps. So it's a significant battle for a number of reasons. Thrown into that were a number of photographers. On your left, Louis Lowry, who was a still photographer with the U.S. Marine Corps. On your right, Bill Ganault, who was a film motion picture photographer for the Marine Corps. The third man was Joe Rosenthal, who was a civilian photographer for the Associated Press. All three met on that mountain that fateful day in February of 1945. Lowry went up with the 1st Battalion on the 4th day of the battle because they wanted to put a flag on top of Suribachi, which was, of course, the highest point on the island, to show that they were claiming the island. It is significant that the raising of this flag was the first time in the history of World War II that any Japanese property had been taken by and had an American flag raised on it. So it had great symbolic significance to do this. Lowry went up with the Corps of Marines onto the top of that mountain that day, and they found a large pipe on the way up, and they used that for a flagpole, and they raised the flag. And Lowry took this picture of what became the first flag raising on Iwo Jima, which is a pretty good picture, actually, if you look at it. It shows the actual process being completed, shows a nice dramatic figure of one of the guards watching for snipers in the front. Has a nice sort of left, right, up, down composition as well. And Lowry thought he had a good winning picture. As he was coming down the mountain later that day, he met another patrol going up with another flag. What had happened was that on the boats, the U.S. Navy, in their hour, they saw the flag go up, and the general decided, or the admiral decided at the time that that was too small a flag. So, hey guys, the old man wants a bigger flag. So a platoon went up with a bigger flag. On the way up with that platoon, Lowry passes him coming down. We're going to raise another flag. Oh, okay. Lowry goes down. He's got his picture. That's going to be the winning picture. Gets down a little further and finds that Ganault is going up there with his motion picture camera, and Rosenthal from AP is going up with his camera. Yeah, they're putting up another flag, sure, you know, so, well, we'll hustle up and get a picture of that one, the second flag raising. The way Clint Eastwood depicted it in his film about this event, Flags of Our Fathers, which is an interesting film if you ever get a chance to see it, by the way. This is sort of what you would have seen if you were standing there watching them. Ganault with his movie camera and Rosenthal with his still press camera. That's the type of heavy-duty equipment you were taking at the time. They both got there, the flag was about to go up. They hustled into place to do it and get a shot. This is a breakdown of the footage of Ganault's motion picture of the raising of the flag. So they've sectioned out stills of it. The whole flag raising process in that film strip takes less than 10 seconds. It's a pretty quick raise. The other shocking thing about that film when you see it is that it's in color. He shot the motion picture of that image actually going up in color. And he thought he had a good shot. He found the right angle to do it. And standing next to him is Rosenthal, waiting with his camera to get the shot. He did, which is this one. So they both got their pictures that day. And they both got down the mountain safely. And Rosenthal sent his image off to be processed. And Ganault went and put his package ready to be sent back to the Marine Corps processor, both of which were on the ships out in the harbor. This, by the way, is another photographer's picture of the first flag coming down, and the second flag having already been raised from a different point of view. So, flag 1 coming down, flag 2 going up, being shot in this dramatic position from another angle. At the same time, Rosenthal also took another picture of all the gang after they had put the flag up. This is that other picture that Rosenthal took. Yay, we got it up. All the guys get them together to take the group shot. When Rosenthal finally got back that evening, he had heard that the film had been processed. He heard that they really loved the picture. This is the picture he thought they really loved. This is the one that he thought was there. Of course it wasn't. The flag raising one was the one that was. A copy of it was wired back to Roosevelt in the White House within 48 hours. Roosevelt knew he had his golden shot, the thing to inspire the whole rest of the war. Rosenthal became famous, was put sent back to the States was signing copies of the picture left and right, as you can see in this particular picture. Gnaus did not. Gnaus was killed on the island 9 days later. He never made it off Iwo Jima. Neither did 3 of the 6 men in that final image. It was that bloody and that fierce a battle that they were in. But the final image took on an entire life of its own, not only aesthetically, but culturally, significantly, politically, for all number of reasons. Kind of the message I wanted you to get from this is the fact that there are many things which combine to make a photograph. Not only in terms of your talent and your ability technically, but also the social conviction of what's there. And also a great deal of happenstance. What do you do if Rosenthal had been climbing up the mountain and he runs into Lowry, and Lowry says, I already got the picture, so he goes back down to the beach and takes other pictures instead. Or if Gnaus had not taken the film strip of the camera as well. And later on, of course, Rosenthal was accused of having posed this picture. And the thing that proved he didn't pose it was Gnaus' motion picture of them actually raising it, which showed the actual moment in the footage when the flag was like that. It was not a posed picture. It was an instantaneous image. And it preserved that whole tradition and importance of what's there. And of course, the image itself has gone on to its own cultural, social, and aesthetic life. You see it on plates, you see it on coins, you see it on medals. The U.S. Marine Corps monument in Washington, D.C. is made after it too. That's become an entire model. What makes a great photograph, in part of those things we talked about in the first instance when I talked about Sarkowski's points, point of view, frame, instant of time, all those things come together. But as well, it happens to be happenstance and preparedness too. Incidentally, the flag did survive and is currently in the Smithsonian. The war ended, VJ Day, another classic image of a sailor kissing a nurse on Broadway on the day of celebration at the end of the war. Incidentally, there's a whole book about this image too now. It's been written because neither the sailor nor the nurse knew each other. Embraced, kissed, went on their way. But it has a whole social story behind it too. And as well, also the whole practice of photojournalism went on. Because the war sharpened many things in terms of how we take pictures and why. And things began to evolve, not only in terms of instantaneous news photography, but also in terms of the whole documentary process too. Surveys were formed, societies were built up, news and press agencies came along. The illustrated press flourished. The picture magazine that Life had started in the 30s became an even more successful story in the 40s and the 50s. Other illustrated magazines, both in America and in Europe and around the world, began to flourish with the halftone process and multiple printings and issuance of magazines in the press. Television was coming along, so there was also demand for more film footage too. And the whole face of modern life was changing dramatically. So with that era comes the positive things of culture and the negative things of the era, including, of course, the rise of the Cold War, the atomic bomb, social change, and all the psychological changes that occur as well. And all that gets revealed in our photographs as we see. I mentioned earlier in the last lecture the Farm Security Administration and its documentation of the world, which occurred in the 30s and into the 40s. Incidentally, I found this online the other day. This is the chief photographer for the Library of Congress making the last photochemical print from the last negative in the files of the Farm Security Administration. After this date, which was 2011, the entire operation no longer is a photochemical one, it's entirely digital now. So the negatives still survive like this, but they're now all in digital processing. We'll get into digital next time. Office of War Information, which evolved from the FSA, covering and documenting life in America during the war. And one of the things that occurred at this period of time was the beginning of commercial enterprises building their own photo units as well. Standard Oil of New Jersey hired Roy Stryker away from the FSA and made him begin to create and head up a documentary project from 1943 to 1950 about Standard Oil's effect commercially in the United States and in the world. Very pro-industry, very pro-life. The whole slogan, of course, a drop of oil in everyone's life. And Stryker began to hire the same photographers he's used in FSA and train a newer generation too. You can see some of it's less obvious than others, but it all looks pretty much like the FSA stuff. It is again somewhat propagandistic, like the FSA, except it's no longer proposing just the American government, but now the oil industry in this country too. The story of shipping, the story of how it maintains our lifelines and keeps us together. And came back again with important documentary and even aesthetically powerful images in the 40s. We talked about the Photo League and their advance and how they ran afoul of the Cold War and the Senate investigation of communist organizations until they were disbanded in '51. Interestingly, out of that group came a New York photographer named Ouija. He named himself after a Ouija board. It was pretty much a cigar-smoking, sort of the prototype for all the press photographers you see in all the movies of the 50s and 60s. This is his office, the trunk of his car. Kept his photography equipment here, kept his typewriter here, kept his police radios in the front. As soon as he heard a crime thing, hopped in the car, drove fast to that place in New York, often getting there before the police. He had a flash. He had rough grain film. He would take a picture, very cold, very direct, often very brutal of a crime scene. In this case, the gun tossed down in front of the victim of the particular shooting. What's interesting is Ouija not only showed the crime scene in all its graphicness, but it also had the intelligence and even the nerve to turn around and photograph the spectators, to show people these are people at the crime scene, to show what the reaction was in culture and society at the time too. He was pretty direct, pretty straightforward in his work. And a bit of really important fitting irony, in 1946 he wandered into an American place and found the dying Alfred Stieglitz there. Stieglitz, who had led the Reformation and dramatic change in photography in the first half of the 20th century in America and indeed in the world, was dying a forgotten man. And Ouija took his picture that night and also wrote about that meeting and how bitter Stieglitz was. And within about a month of this picture being made, Stieglitz was dead. The era was changing rapidly. Established also in 1947 was the Magnum Photo Agency. Commercial message at this point, that's the subject of our exhibition over at the Ransom Center right now. So, you want to gain extra points? I can't help you, but go over there anyway. It is very good. It was established in 1947, set up by Robert Capa, Henri Cartier-Bresson, George Roger, and David Seymour Shim, four photographers who had a good reputation even before the war and throughout the war. But they decided that they were being shortchanged by the magazines of the day. When you took a picture for a magazine, you handed over your negatives. You never saw them again. And you went out and got your next assignment or paid for that, and you never saw them again. And they might sit in a file and collect dust and then be thrown away after 20 years. Or they might pop up in the strangest places some other day and you never be paid for their use later on. And Capa said, hell no, this isn't right. And set up this agency and set up international offices and hired other photographers in the 50s. They controlled their images. They maintained their copyright on their images, and they had a staff to market those images. And you went out and picked your stories. You weren't assigned by a magazine. You weren't told to go out Wednesday and take these pictures of this farmer and get them back here by Thursday. You set your own pace. You were responsible for your own life in that respect. And that attitude revolutionized photojournalism and became the model for other future agencies. So these are some of the early members of the group. Capa, of course, famous again for his pictures of the Spanish Civil War, of the D-Day invasion, of this dramatic and still controversial picture of a soldier being killed in action in Spain, which in our cynical modern age everybody has claimed is now fake, so it's still debated about. shows pictures of children in the aftermath of World War II and the orphan children of Europe. Cartier-Bresson's always lyrical compositions. He was probably the rebel in Magnum. He was less concerned with photo stories than he was with making his own art. George Roger, who was so turned off by World War II that he photographed nothing but other cultures and other societies in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Eve Arnold, who actually documented the civil rights movement in this country, and did it perhaps from one of the best perspectives because she did not adopt entirely one attitude of showing either blacks or whites. She showed both sides of the coin very well. On to Susan Meiselas. She's a little bit later, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I think it's important to note her because A, she's currently heads up Magnum, and B, by the 1970s, she was introducing color into photojournalism and was not afraid, in fact, very unafraid, to show such brutal things as dying children in Nicaragua who had been killed in the gun battle, standing in line and actually in the line of fire, and of course getting her pictures distributed by magazines to show that brutal confrontation in the 70s. The point is, Magnum not only established something in the beginning, but it continued to survive and it continued to expand. Until today, it has some 70 or 80 members and still contributes new things to the imagery of our documentation of the world every year. There are continuing trends at mid-century. We have to consider those, of course, the things that occur. Photojournalism. In this country, strange to say, the 35mm camera hadn't caught on yet. In the 40s and 50s, this is the entire photographic unit of the Houston Chronicle. Everybody's using these big press cameras with the flash bulbs, and these are all battery packs. You put that on your shoulders so you went up and had power for your strobe. And that's the way you maintain the flexibility with taking pictures. The 35mm really didn't win the scene in American photojournalism until the 60s. And you see in the pictures even from the 40s and the 50s, this is the retirement of Babe Ruth, photographers on the sideline with their equipment taking such pictures. It was good for news photography. It was good for instantaneous stories. The famous picture of a successful Harry Truman being elected president, showing the Chicago Sun-Times image of the fact that Dewey beat him. Or such things as the rise of our young rock and roll talents like Elvis Presley and a few fans from the 50s. That's the type of instantaneous news pictures that occurred in photojournalism at the time. But documentary photography also began. The 35mm did begin to eclipse it. David Douglas Duncan served with the Marines and photographed them in the freezing temperatures of Korea in 1951. Or again, the fight against segregation in the South. People like Bruce Davison and others who went down to show the struggle for support of the military and the support of changing attitudes in the South in the 50s. That whole picture of what was going on as the Eisenhower administration tried to reform segregation and become part of that whole integration movement is shown in the photographers who went out and took the pictures in those days. The picture magazine, as I said, flourished. This is a picture page from Life. But the documentary story didn't have to be just instantaneous news. You could look at something in depth. Gene Smith went and photographed a small Spanish village in the 1950s. And this is a typical page layout in Life. And you can see how each picture, big or small, as it was laid out, contains a whole story and a whole impact in and of itself. Smith went into the Deep South not to cover the integration story, but to cover the everyday life of people, such as a country doctor or a nurse midwife, and did them again with moving pictures at the time. Other people like Gordon Parks went to Harlem and covered street gangs in the 50s. Then others still went around and showed the whole globe. Ellis Hoffman's a very famous picture of the Gold Coast in Spain. So you had travel and documentary work done. The whole commercial image of the enterprise of what went on in the studio continued. You tried to do pictorial work. You also began to concentrate on things like portraiture, This is the very famous picture of David Ben-Gurion with the documents setting aside the state of Israel in 1948, done by Arnold Newman. Arnold Newman was a very famous portrait photographer who developed what was called environmental portraiture. He did not bring you into the studio and put you against a gray background. He went to your home, he went to your studio, he went to your office and took your picture in your environment where you were. So this is Ben-Gurion in the Israeli Museum. Nature photography continued to expand, but color began to be more broadly added to it. And of course, fashion photography continues. The look of things like Richard Avedon and Irving Penn. Some, again, elaborate photographic studio work, but others more adventurous. People like Harper's Bazaar began to send Avedon and a whole crew over to Paris to do their photo fashion layouts and do the models in the actual setting in exotic locales. The same for advertising. Smirnoff's ad campaign for vodka in the 1950s. How do we show you how fresh and resolving vodka is? Well, we send a team over to Egypt and photograph it against the pyramid. And travel photography too. Fritz Lang was documenting the Hawaiian Islands. It occurred to him he'd seen many pictures of the fishermen throwing their nets out into the sea. So Fritz said, I'll try something new. Stood out in the middle of the tide waters and had them throw the nets at the camera. Took a lot of nets in the face in the process, but he also set up an entire style. Now, there you go to any travel ad anywhere in the magazine still today, and you'll find Hawaii pictures of the fishermen throwing the nets at the camera. That sort of thing went on. It began to be seen as well in the painting schools of the day. I mentioned earlier the realistic school. That, of course, continued. But new element came into development. Abstract expressionism began to be seen. That evolved out of those earlier European expressions paintings you saw in the 20s and the 30s, as well as the sort of American naturalistic abstraction that occurred. And it reflected both that economic growth of the era and also that internal, unsettling post-atomic Cold War era that was there. That nervousness and tension which were rising, which were becoming more evident of after the war, became very significant. So it may have started with more simple compositions of form like Arthur Dove or George O'Keeffe, who advocated that you looked at things closely and you found significant design elements in the work, and that's what you presented in your painting. But it began to get this whole abstract set. Pierre Mondrian did entirely abstracts using right-angled squares, cubes, to delineate the depiction of what was going on in the world around him. Mark Rothko used elaborate color palettes in big canvases. If you ever get a chance to go to the Rothko Chapel in Houston, do so. It's a wonderful environmental experience. It was to depict mood in a sense. 180 degrees on that end, of course, Jackson Pollock, his famous drip paintings, which revolutionized that whole era in the 50s and 60s of nervousness and tension and what was growing up in design-wise at the time. All these things began to take place. All these things supposedly photography can't do, only painting can do, because photography is too literal, it's too objective. Except that a whole means of personal expression was also beginning to evolve in photography at the same time in the 50s. That whole flexibility, that whole younger rising generation that was growing at the time was becoming more aware of what was there. Art departments actually began to hire photographers, much to the concern of sculptors and painters at the time. But they did because they saw that there was an aesthetic that was being approached. Some of it certainly a bit more formal, but some of it a bit more intimate in detail. And some of it even moody. Roy de Carava's famous photographs of musicians in Harlem, for example, which didn't show the whole face, it only showed fragments of instruments and details of form. Or Doc Edgerton's famous flash photography, which he had invented in the 30s and 40s, which was used now for more aesthetic purposes. Harry Callahan went and photographed his own wife Not one time, not 10 times, not as a beauty or as an odalisque or anything like that, but in all their intimacy of their relationship over 40 years. Other pictures began to play with different elements so that things became more abstract. And people like Jerry Uelsmann began to actually take the elements that formed an image and use such darkroom techniques as solarization and multiple printings and masking to try and get puzzling pictures. They even began to play with the whole chemistry as well. John Wood just simply took a piece of exposed color film, drip developer on it to get his shapes and do it. You were playing not with the camera image, but with the entire physical process of development. So those sort of things occurred, and that had a profound effect throughout the world. When Dan mentioned the rise of existentialism and like, that had a significant effect upon the way photographers in the creative mind were doing it too. Things became more confrontational in photography, more puzzling in terms of their setting, more dramatic in terms of not trying to find the pretty picture, but find the more edge to realism in what was there. And we began to play with light abstractions, or reverse tones and printing. Or we began to do collages, which were cutouts, and which were combined not to make sense, or not to make a pretty imitation of a painting, but to rather find their own language. That sort of abstraction was what was being made an answer to the palettes of people like Rothko and others. Even some of them have, of course, well, this is Angus MacBean. Angus MacBean is one of the great punsters in photography, so this was his attempt to do a self-portrait a la Picasso. You do see cubism in here, I hope. With a wisp in it. Two things occurred in the 50s to really make that notable in the world. One was the World Exhibition of Photography at Lucerne, which occurred basically in the summer of '52. Which brought in some 2,500 photographs from around the world, many shows all throughout the city of Lucerne. Economically, it was a disaster, but socially and politically for photography, it put them on the map. If they could take over a whole city for a long time and celebrate all manner of photography. And it did celebrate all manner. There was a history component, there was a contemporary component, there was an abstract component, there was a pictorial component. All that was there in the history. I always love their posters with the multiple lightning strikes too. The biggest thing perhaps in 1955 was The Family of Man. Steichen, who by this time was head of the Museum of Modern Art, decided to do a very positive look at celebrating the goodness of man. He spent about 4 years putting this together, drawing pictures from around the world. And this is about 503 photographs by 273 photographers from 68 nations. It was truly an international show. It was intended to be. Yes, it had a certain surface in photojournalism and documentary traditions. You weren't going to find a lot of abstract pictures in there. You weren't going to find a lot of negative feeling imagery. But beyond that, it was meant to be that sort of reflection of the age, if you will, the sort of last optimistic era of America at the time. There are many editions of the catalog, and this is a couple of scenes from the shows laid out in MoMA. By the way, after it ran its time in MoMA, it was divided up and traveled in different components around the world for something like 7 or 8 years too. So it was continuing to have an impact throughout the 50s. But it was a truly consuming environmental show. It didn't have just blank white walls and one line of pictures. It had large pictures, small pictures, things you walked around, things that were above your head, even photographs under you that you could step on too. It was all this sort of thing, this all-consuming world of photography that once you entered the museum, you were immersed in from the beginning. That involvement was very there. Perhaps the man who first singles out the entire first half of the century in photography is Steichen. You remember him from his early work with the photo secessionists, his picture of J.P. Morgan with his hand on the chair arm that looked like a butcher knife. But he also experimented with form, experimented with abstraction, starting in the 20s. He went to Europe and discovered Picasso and others and sent them back to Stieglitz. Stieglitz could show them in his galleries. His fashion photography was very much on edge. It was not just a pretty picture. He was defining forms and shaping new movements in photography in the 20s and 30s. He first envisioned himself in his youth as a painter. This is a self-portrait as painter. By the end, he was a grizzled vet of documentary traditions, such as, again, I show you the picture of him heading the naval unit in World War II. He ended his days for the last 2 decades as head of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, and he pointed profoundly in the directions of where modern art was going at the time. In contrast to that, the latter half of the century is probably heralded at the beginning by a man named Robert Frank. Frank was Swiss by birth, but he received a Guggenheim grant in the 50s. He wanted to travel America and photograph America in his style. His style was not optimistic like The Family of Man. It was very cynical. It was very direct and harsh. His work appealed greatly to people like the Beats and the Beat generation and those cultural influences that were there. Indeed, in fact, the introduction of his famous book, The American, was done by Jack Kerouac. Frank's pictures were very direct. They were not manipulated. They were strongly printed. This image of a streetcar where each window of the streetcar becomes a framed image in and of itself. And the images of reflections in the windows above and on the side below of the board reflect other things that are harder to read and harder to see. People read it as cultural disadvantage. They read the fact that classes were seen. They read the fact that there was pessimism and lack of optimism in the world at the time. Kerouac goes on in his essay greatly about this young lady riding the elevator and how tired she looks and how beaten down she looks by the system and by the services of just lifting people up and down in an elevator. Incidentally, years later, they found this lady, and she settled into quite a happy middle-class life. So anyway, what the image means at the time versus what happens to you afterwards, another question too entirely. But the important thing is that Frank set this tone. And when the Americans book was published at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, generally speaking, the critics hated it. It was too cynical, it was too depressing, it was not what America was all about. Yet, by the end of the 60s, it was heralded as one of the major American photo books. What was going to happen in this next decade to the culture to shift it like that? And what was going to happen in society? And what was he going to set up in the way of tone, in the way of approach, in the way of documenting society and bringing back these images? That was important to consider, and that is what we'll consider next time with the photographs too. Frank becomes the herald for the remainder of the decade. In cinema, all I can do is rush you through the periods of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I sort of set this decade aside as one in which the whole evolution changed in filmmaking. It became very much an institution. It became very much a system. The studio system became firmly established. More so in America, of course, than in the dysfunction of what would happen in Europe with World War II. But certain trends and certain genres were set in the 30s, which continue to evolve for the next 30 years in film. And you see these when you inspect some of the films that came out during this time. Just a few quick examples. People on Sunday in Germany in the 30s, which was nothing more than a naturalistic attempt to show people enjoying a Sunday afternoon and do it in a new, innovative filmmaking style. Very simple, very understated, very direct. A tone piece, if you will. Had a different feel entirely. M, which came out at the same time in Germany by Fritz Lang, the man who gave us Metropolis in the silent era. This was, of course, the early sound era now in the 30s. And we've had this story of all things, a child murderer. You were not shown the crimes. They were all implied, of course, in the graphic tension that made a star out of Peter Lorre, who was a very famous film person in Germany at the time, but became an international star with this image too. And it showed the whole tonality of such The subtlety of this film is the fact that the man's a child murderer, and yet by the end of the film, you're feeling sympathy for him. That sort of thing, that sort of power that the film could do was very important. Marx Brothers' Duck Soup, which is, of course, a satire on war and politics, featuring our man Groucho and other brothers in their work, too. Simply a heavy-handed, ham-handed satire, which is one of the funniest films in the world. If you see it with a crowd. Incidentally, I should mention it's also a musical. Yes. But talk about musicals, perhaps the most phenomenal one was The Gold Diggers of 1933. Yes, a sexist title, grant you that. But it was an all-singing, all-star dance of the three young struggling actresses who want to make it big in Broadway, and the big Broadway numbers they have. But it's a very interesting movie because it takes head-on the Depression. These people are not making a success of their lives. They're struggling actors and actresses in the theater. They do these phenomenal dances about money and the economy. They also, this is the days before the tightened laws and restrictions on sex in the cinema, so it gets become very risque in places as well. And at the same time, it has this social satire. The big number, Joan Blondell singing My Forgotten Man, which is all about the fact that the men who were troops in World War I are now starving and on the street, and singing this mournful chorus with her. That sort of social commentary is very strong in what is supposed to be a light and happy music. King Kong, okay, special effects. What do I say? One of the earliest attempts to really do a big scale monster movie, which has some tremendous special effects. Even when you look at them today, they're still pretty outstanding, by Willis O'Brien. Triumph of the Will. Perhaps no other documentary so sets to a tone of what's there. Leni Riefenstahl, the lady pictured here, photographed Hitler's Nuremberg rally in the mid-30s, a multi-day celebration of the Nazi Party. It's a very important film, not only in terms of its technique and its setting, but also to really show you the social power that was there in filmmaking. It showed you the grand spectacle of the National Socialist Party in Germany, but it also showed you close up the image of Hitler and his magnetism as a speaker, and it also focused on the madness and society of the individuals in the crowd. It could really show you the seductive power of what was going on in Germany at the time. It's a powerful film to see even today. Charlie Chaplin, combining in modern times his own sense of humor with the satire upon social restrictions in the culture and the machine age and what it was doing to man at the time in the 30s. Grand Illusion by Jean Renoir. Perhaps no other filmmaker so comments upon culture and society as him. This is the story of an aristocratic German general who captures a number of French soldiers, including a French aristocrat who he tries to persuade to his side, and the whole clash of cultures in the time of war. And of course, if you talk spectacle, we have to talk Gone with the Wind in 1939, because there was nothing quite like it in terms of its scope and its magnitude and its color. I'm trusting you've seen that. Stagecoach as well, John Ford's picture from 1939, which is a fascinating story of both a simple struggle for survival crossing the West, and pictures, in fact, that he took the camera out into the West and shows the pictures, but also very interesting for its use of light, drama, and structure in the making of the film. And finally, leading out of the Depression into World War II, The Grapes of Wrath by Ford, which used as its source of imagery and inspiration the FSA pictures, the strikers, to help design the sets and to tell Steinbeck's powerful tale of the expansion and the rush to the West Coast. Cinema in the 40s and the 50s was affected as well by that same post-war era. Orson Welles, of course, Citizen Kane, 1001 Reasons Why it set up the whole imagery of mystery and storytelling with dramatic filmmaking. Casablanca, if you want the height of romanticism and what was there in culture at the time. The Best Years of Our Lives, which dared to focus on the end of the war And the fact that, okay, we won the war, now we have to go back to daily life. How do we make that adjustment into society and culture? It's a very serious and very important film. It's a Wonderful Life, which is ostensibly considered a pretty schmaltzy picture, but I think also tells a pretty strong, heavy message about what it was like to try and survive in the Depression. The Bicycle Thief, which is part of the neo-realist movement in post-World War II Italy, showing what life was struggling like when a father and son have to maintain their bond and he loses his bicycle and his source of income. And The Third Man, filmed in post-World War II Europe and Austria, showing the story of how what you may appear to be reality and what you think is real is very different from what it is. In the 50s, Rashomon, a very important Japanese film which tells the story of a rape and a murder, but tells it from different points of view, so that the whole question of what is truth and what is reality becomes the blend and blur, and you have to try and figure that out. The paranoia of the 50s, the Red Scare, showed in the horror movies at the time. What better way to talk about that than with science fiction? With The Thing in 1951, or The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, very metaphysical, very mystical. What is life? What is death? Why has God deserted us? Has he or not? The imagery and singleness of this image set Bergman up as a major filmmaker. The Sweet Smell of Success, about the rot of American culture as depicted by Alexander McKendrick. The whole side of there are no good people in society and in culture. And what better way to end it than Psycho, where the whole society is curated to such an extent that what appears to be normal is not, what appears to be regular is not, and in fact, who may be the hero and who may be the victim changes underfoot even as you watch it. That whole temperament of the time, we've gone from the heroism of World War II to an underlying unsettling movement. It's shown in painting, it's shown in film, it's shown in photography, and it's about to crash right into the 60s in a dramatic way.